Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a deeply theological and honestly historically rich sermon by Sayed Mohammad Tanveer Hashmi. We're zeroing in on a concept that is just absolutely central to Islamic theology, the rights of the Ahle Bait, or the family of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, whether you're already super well-versed in Islamic history or you're just looking to get a firmer grasp on the core frameworks of this faith, we're going to break down the theological roots, the historical context, and the practical, everyday applications of this really profoundly important topic. Okay, let's dive into this because the source material immediately tackles the modern elephant in the room. Sayed Hashmi points out that discussions around the Prophet's family, especially during the Islamic month of Muharram, they often trigger these intense and completely unnecessary sectarian controversies. There's this lingering question in certain circles: does heavily praising the Prophet's family somehow diminish the respect owed to the Sahaba, the Prophet's companions? The speaker addresses this tension head-on, really aiming to clarify what the true religious obligations of the believers actually are.
To grasp this fully, we'll follow a clear, five-part journey today. First up, modern misconceptions. Second, the Quran and the reward of prophethood. Third, the Quran and the Ahle Bait. Fourth, the consequences of enmity. And finally, number 5, the practical fulfillment of these rights.
All right, kicking things off with Part 1, Modern Misconceptions, specifically focusing on sectarian divides. Here, Sayed Hashmi forcefully dismantles what he identifies as a totally false narrative. There's a misconception, one that's often pushed in certain linguistic and cultural circles today, that excessively praising the Ahle Bait, or even just frequently chanting the names of figures like Ali or Hussein, somehow equates to Shi'ism or sectarian deviation. But he argues, impartially from his own tradition, that this division is entirely fabricated. The true Islamic balance, he says, requires absolute reverence for the Sahaba, alongside a deep obligatory love for the Ahle Bait. They just aren't in competition. Drawing comparisons between the two, the source describes that as a modern theological trap. Building on that idea, the discourse presents a very stark, almost binary worldview that emerged in the wake of the tragedy of Karbala. Hashmi asserts that, ideologically speaking, there are no longer multiple sects. There are literally only two unchangeable mindsets left in the Ummah. On one side, you have the Husseini Maslak, which represents devotion, justice, and an unwavering love for the Prophet's family. On the exact opposite side is the Yazidi Maslak, representing enmity, oppression, and an active attempt to diminish the household's legacy. He basically uses this binary to categorize all modern discourse regarding the Ahle Bait.
And that brings us to Part 2, Quran and reward of prophethood, the divine command. I want you to consider this for a second. How could a community ever possibly repay a prophet who served for 23 grueling years of persecution and hardship?
And this brilliantly illustrates the answer. Right here in Surah Ash-Shura, the Quran establishes this concept of ajra el-risalat, or the reward of prophethood. You see, the prophet wasn't asking for wealth or thrones or sprawling empires. The only requested payment for his entire prophetic mission was love and devotion toward his family. The text makes it a point to emphasize that loving them isn't just, a nice gesture. It's the divine compensation literally commanded by God. So who exactly falls under this divine command? Well, the sermon details a very specific historical moment to define the Ahle Bait. When asked about who these mandatory rights actually applied to, the Prophet gathered Ali, his daughter Fatima, and his grandsons Hassan and Hussein, and he placed his cloak over them. He declared them his household. The source emphasizes a really beautiful spiritual transaction here. Loving these specific individuals guarantees the love of both the Prophet and God himself.
Which builds directly into Part 3, Quran and Ahle Bait, the inseparable bond.
So the crucial point is embedded right here in the famous Hadith of Thaqalain. The Prophet announced he was leaving behind two weighty things to guide the believers. By holding on to both the Book of Allah and his progeny, a believer is guaranteed to never go astray. The discourse really stresses that these two forces are sort of cosmically tied together, and they will remain completely united until the Day of Judgment. To highlight just how unbreakable this bond is, the analysis shares this chilling, incredibly powerful historical anecdote. Following the massacre at Karbala, as the captive household was being marched through the bazaars of Damascus, witnesses reported hearing Imam Hussein's severed head raised high on a spear, literally reciting verses of the Quran. For the speaker, this is the ultimate, miraculous proof that the Ahle Bait and the Quran cannot be separated, even in death. Based on that profound connection, the material systematically lists the mandatory rights, or hukuk, that the Ahle Bait hold over the Muslim community. And it isn't just a passive respect. It requires deep affection, unwavering obedience, and a fierce, active defense of their honor against any detractors. Furthermore, faith and even daily prayers are considered totally incomplete without constantly including them in the salawat, the sending of blessings upon the Prophet.
Now we are pivoting to a much darker and more intense phase of the text in Part 4, Consequences of Enmity and Severe Prophetic Warnings.
Having established their immense rights, the source cites a hadith detailing specific categories of individuals who are explicitly cursed by Allah and all prophets. These include folks who alter the meanings of the Quran, those who make the forbidden permissible, which, by the way, Sayed Hashmi directly ties to the actions of the tyrant Yazid, and crucially those who disrespect the sanctity of the Al Bait. The sermon impartially reports that attempting to diminish the household's legacy is, quite frankly, a spiritually fatal offense.
And the warnings don't stop there. The text outlines the stark, ultimate spiritual fate for those who harbor jealousy toward the Prophet's family or attempt to silence their mention. According to the traditions cited here, harboring that kind of enmity ensures that a person will be resurrected on the Day of Judgment alongside the absolute worst of hypocrites and transgressors, completely stripped of their faith.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer intensity of the prophetic hadith used to drive this point home. The source relays a tradition stating that anyone who fails to recognize the rights of the Ahle Bait, the Ansar, and the Arabs will possess one of three traits. They are either a hypocrite, of illegitimate birth, or conceived during a state of ritual impurity. By reporting this, the analysis illustrates the absolute gravity and the uncompromising nature of failing to honor the Prophet's lineage within this specific theological framework. Let's take a breath and transition to our uplifting conclusion, Part 5, Practical Fulfillment of Rights, Living the Legacy. How do these abstract theological concepts translate into actionable lifestyle choices today? Well, the material gives us very specific advice. To keep the legacy alive, followers are urged to name their children after the household, using names like Ali, Fatima, Hassan, and Hussein. Families are encouraged to actively host gatherings that recount their virtues, to constantly recite blessings upon them, and maybe most importantly, to boldly ignore any sectarian detractors who try to label this devotion as controversial. Remember, even prayers are invalid without sending blessings upon the Prophet's family. The source also highlights this really fascinating cultural and spiritual practice. It mentions that writing specific verses or poetry invoking the protection and blessings of the Al Bait and actually placing them on the doorframes of a house serves as a spiritual shield. It's presented as a tangible, daily way for a family to invite divine blessings and ward off evil from their home.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, right? From the divine commands in the Quran to the chilling warnings of history, and finally to the beautiful, practical ways this love is expressed in everyday life. So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up. Based on everything we've explored from this source, how are you keeping the legacy and love of the Ahle Bait alive in your own home? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.